Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're joined by Chase, and we're going to discuss, or rather expand upon, one of the previous topics that I've very recently covered. As you may remember, I talked about burnout and how systems often fail first and then charge people for the damage those failures create. And today I want to zoom out a little bit because that pattern isn't necessarily unique to workplaces or benefit systems or universities. It is something I've seen across many different kinds of systems. And I've learned from being on both sides of them. I used to work for the NHS, answering phones, obviously in other duties as well. And sometimes patients would shout at me because the system had failed them. And the difficult part was that they were right. The system had failed them. But what they couldn't necessarily see was that I was drowning in exactly the same dysfunction that they were. Everything that they've experienced as patients, I experienced as an employee and also as a patient too. And later, I became a claimant dealing with an entirely different public service. And I was on the other end of the different phone line, just different system, but the same experience. And that led me to a principle I've never actually forgotten. And that is that a compromised system compromises everyone inside it, and that harm doesn't discriminate. Patients and nurses, claimants and advisors, students and teachers, they're all inside the same system, experiencing the same dysfunction from different directions. And as a software engineer, that reminds me of a basic principle in cybersecurity. When a system is compromised, you don't assume only one component is affected. You assume the compromise can propagate throughout the system. So social systems, of course, aren't software, but people are still components within those systems. And the same pattern appear and persist. And on the other hand, it is very interesting that actually starts much earlier than institutions. It starts in families. For example, a dysfunctional family often doesn't optimize for the well-being of its members. It optimizes for stability, even if stability means depending on unhealthy patterns and dynamics. So, of course, it is very well known that from the moment somebody begins recovering or setting healthier boundaries, they're often treated as a problem. And that's not because they're wrong, it's simply because they've become incompatible with a system that previously depended on the components being exactly the same and doing exactly the same things again and again in order to keep functioning. And that same architecture scales upwards. When a neurodivergent person or student receives detention instead of support, a disabled employee becomes ill and is punished for reduced productivity or fired. A claimant with the least energy receives the most paperwork. And of course, when that defeats them, it is recorded as non-compliance, and ultimately they're punished for that. So that's different environments, different institutions, but the same underlying architecture. So why doesn't anything change? And it is a question that I think has three possible reasons. First, it is that systems defend their own equilibrium. So any system naturally protects the behaviors that keep it functioning, even when those behaviors are harmful. Solutions often require changing the system itself, so the system resists them. Second, harm becomes normalized. Every compromise standard slowly becomes a new baseline. People stop asking why is something happening, and they start saying that's just how things are. And third, problems become infrastructure. Organizations build departments, processes, funding models, and identities around managing problems. And if an institution, a role, etc., depend on a problem continuing to exist, then solving that problem can begin to feel like a threat. And I've experienced that personally. As a software engineer, I have repeatedly offered my time and expertise to organizations struggling with technical problems and technical debt that I genuinely believed I could help solve or contribute to solving. But all of the time, that was rejected and there was no interest at all. And I think that this is mainly because real solutions don't just fix one issue. They ripple, they expose assumptions, they expose the harm that has already perpetuated the system. They force connected systems to change as well. And I think that the most difficult question in the situation is not what are the solutions, but it's rather what would have to change if one of those solutions actually worked or was actually implemented. Fortunately, systems can change, and for example, the system scientist Donella Meadows argued that not all interventions have equal leverage. Most organizations spend their energy tweaking numbers, let's say budgets, thresholds, targets. And as engineers, we do recognize that as changing, it equals rather changing constants in a program whose architecture is still wrong. So much stronger interventions involve changing information flows, making harm visible, changing what gets measured, changing the rules, and ultimately changing the goal itself. For example, a benefit system designed primarily to minimize fraud behaves very differently from one designed primarily to reduce suffering. So the stuff is the same, budget is the same, but the purpose changes everything downstream. And I've seen alternatives work before. For example, Elinor Ostrom showed that communities can successfully govern shared resources without relying solely on centralized control. And I think the point isn't that change is impossible. The problems around us often aren't sustained because nobody knows the solution. The problems are sustained because genuine solutions require structures to change, and structures don't usually volunteer to change themselves. Usually systems to defend their equilibrium. But every system we have today was once alternative somebody chose to build. So perhaps the most important thing you can do is to be willing to become incompatible with systems that depend on your silence. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that was interesting. I hope that you learned something new today, and take care.